This fine figure of a man is Ben Jonson. Very brilliant, very clever, enigmatical, sometimes very funny, contemporary or very near contemporary of William Shakespeare. And today I want to look at some of his contributions to the first folio. Actually, in a previous upload, I've already discussed this poem signed B.I. on the right. This is Shakespeare's first folio of 1623. You'll remember this is where 36 Shakespeare's plays were published in one massive book, many of them for the first time. The book, we think, was edited by Ben Jonson, and he contributes 2 poems to it in the prefatory pages. This is the first of them, which captions the picture to the right by Martin Droeshout, and it gives away the fact that Ben Jonson knew perfectly well that William Shakespeare was Edward de Vere. Now, if you don't know how that is shown, or how this poem reveals it, you need to go to a shorter presentation called Ben Jonson Knew, and that's all explained there, how we know that Ben Jonson knew. So have a look at that if you haven't. Otherwise, we're going to continue, and I'm going to look more really at this poem. This is the second one that Ben Jonson contributes to Shakespeare's folio, and you can see it's longer and it's slightly more serious, and it has a lot of very interesting things about it that are relevant to the Shakespeare authorship question and to the identity of William Shakespeare. But we are going to take it as read. If you've seen the previous presentation, that Jonson knew it was Edward de Vere. Now let's see what hints are lying hidden here. Let's start with the title. It's a title of 17 words long, and many of you will be aware that 17 is a number that is relevant to the 17th Earl of Oxford, who was the poet and playwright who used the pseudonym William Shakespeare. To the memory of my beloved the author, Mr. W.W. Look how that double V has been written, W in French. If you've seen a presentation that I put online about this, it's the third part actually of Where is Shakespeare Really Buried, and I explain how a double V was a pseudonym used by Edward de Vere as well as William Shakespeare. He actually signs a letter double V in one place, and you can see how those 2 V's aren't even touching each other. So it's again a little hint that we're looking at de Vere. But I want you to look at the word author, a hell of a lot bigger than almost anything else written on that page. To the memory of my beloved the author, very important, Mr. William Shakespeare, written in rather smaller writing. In fact, if you compare the capital R of author to the capital R beneath it in Shakespeare, you see what I mean. The author much, much bigger and therefore much more important than the name. Now, we all know why that is. It's because the name is a pseudonym. But let's hear it from Ben Jonson himself and see what he actually has to say about it. He begins the poem, "To draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name." Notice he puts Shakespeare in a bracket. To draw no envy on thy name. How do you draw envy on somebody's name? Well, the answer should be fairly obvious. You praise it. If I sit around saying someone's name is absolutely fantastic and go on and on and on doing that, then people will get envious, will they not, of the name. Ben Jonson had many ways in which he traditionally praised people's names. Let us look at something he wrote, which is on the memorial to the poet Drayton in Westminster Abbey, supposedly by Ben Jonson. And he says, "To Drayton's name, whose sacred dust we recommend unto thy trust, protect his memory and preserve his story, remain a lasting monument of his glory. And when thy ruins shall disclaim to be the treasurer of his name that cannot fade shall be an everlasting monument to thee." So these are the ways that Ben Jonson uses to praise a name, but he's flatly refusing to do this in the case of Shakespeare. To draw no envy, Shakespeare, on thy name, and he's not going to use these ways. These ways were not the paths I meant unto thy praise. So why is he not going to praise the name? Well, Ben Jonson very kindly gives us 3 good reasons why he's not going to praise Shakespeare's name. Number 1, For silliest ignorance on these may light, which when it sounds at best, but echoes right. In other words, those of silliest ignorance will not be able to tell the difference between a real sound and an echo. A very good reason not to praise someone's name. They'll think it's the true name, perhaps. Reason number 2, he says, or blind affection, which doth ne'er advance the truth, but gropes and urgeth all by chance. In other words, those of blind affection, so blinded by their affection are they, that they will not be able to find the truth. They'll be like people just groping in the dark towards it, blinded by their own affection. His third reason he gives is crafty malice. Those of crafty malice might pretend this praise and think to ruin where it seemed to raise. In other words, the malicious will say, oh yes, yes, William Shakespeare of Stratford, praise, 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 knowing damn well that by doing so you are sinking the reputation of the true author. So those are 3 reasons why he is not going to praise Shakespeare's name. These reasons, you say, as some infamous bawd. He's talking about a bawd or whore. These are as some infamous bawd or whore should praise a matron. A matron, of course, means a married woman of rank or dignity. So he's comparing the techniques of praising a name, in Shakespeare's case, to a whore praising a dignified married woman of rank. So he really is saying we are not going to praise Shakespeare's name. Now, Stratfordians are rather lost about this, and they just say, very odd, those first lines, he's being rude about Shakespeare. He's not being rude about Shakespeare. Of course he's not. He's just telling you he's not going to praise his name, and the reason for that is it's not his name. Now, this is interesting. I therefore will begin, soul of the age. Where's he beginning? Oh, he's beginning on line 17. 17, remember, is a number very significant of the 17th Earl of Oxford, and he begins his poem on line 17, having in 16 lines told us why he's not going to praise his name. Now, I'm going to go a little bit further down the poem. I'm not going to go through every line of the poem, it would take too long. Just little bits that seem to be very relevant to the authorship question. For if I thought thy judgment were of years, I would commit thee surely with thy peers. So here Jonson is talking about what time frame Shakespeare was writing in, and he's going to compare him to his peers of the same time frame. So I would commit thee surely with thy peers, and tell how far thou didst our Lily outshine, or Sporting Kid, or Marlowe's mighty line. So he names 3 playwrights, Lily, Kyd and Marlowe. Remember, Ben Jonson's writing this in 1623. You have to go back 30 years to get anything by these 3 playwrights. In fact, not one of them seems to have written a single play after 1593. Now, 1593 is the date that Edward de Vere first uses the pseudonym Shakespeare. So it leaves the Stratfordians in a terrible pickle here, because they think that Shakespeare is actually a contemporary of much later playwrights. But Jonson is a contemporary himself, and he's telling us that the contemporaries were Lily, Kyd and Marlowe, and these were all playwrights of the 1580s, not the 1590s. We have the Stratfordians saying, oh, Shakespeare was writing plays in 1606 or something. Well, why on earth would Ben Jonson go back 30 years to name contemporary writers and not mention any of these that the Stratfordians... It really is time that Stratfordian historians start looking carefully at what Shakespeare's contemporaries and people at the time were writing and stop just going off on their wrong directions. Okay, enough lecturing. My voice is beginning to sound strident, I can tell. Okay, let's look again at this interesting fact that he begins the poem on the 17th line. I therefore will begin, soul of the age. In fact, this section goes all the way to line 40. Why do I say that? If you look at line 41, He says, "Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show, to whom all scenes of Europe homage owe." So he's changed his address. He was talking to Shakespeare, soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of the stage. "My Shakespeare, rise, I will not lodge thee," by Chaucer. He's talking to Shakespeare all the way until line 40, when he changes address to Britain. "Triumph, my Britain, thou hast one to show." He's now talking to Britain. He's not talking to Shakespeare anymore. So he addresses Shakespeare from lines 17 to line 40. Now, those of you who have seen my presentation, Where is Shakespeare, really buried, particularly towards the end of part 1 of that. Also in part 3, I give many, many examples where Shakespeare de Vere is referred to as 1740. And here we have it again. Ben Jonson is doing it from 17 to 40. It's very significant in an age where numbers mattered enormously and had significance. Modern poets don't deal with numbers very much, not interested in them. But in the days of Jonson and indeed Shakespeare, numbers were very, very important. And the fact that Shakespeare is being addressed from line 1740 is significant to the fact that his identity is Edward de Vere. Okay. Now, I want to draw your attention to something very interesting, which is Ben Jonson being repetitive. He's not often very repetitive. Here in the poem opposite the Droeshout, he describes Shakespeare as gentle Shakespeare. If we turn the page to the second poem, we see that he says gentle Shakespeare. Exactly the same thing twice. Are we saying that Jonson lacks imagination? Why is he pushing the point of gentle? What does gentle mean? Well, no, it does not mean that he held a vase very carefully or that he was good at stroking cats. I don't think anyone thinks that. Actually, if we go to the Oxford Dictionary definition of gentle, we see of persons well born, belonging to a family of position, originally used synonymously with noble. Now, obviously, that definition is extremely unsatisfactory to the Stratfordian position, and so the Stratfordians will say, hang on, don't rush off with that one, because there is a secondary meaning in heraldic use, having the rank or status of gentleman, the distinguishing mark of which is the right to bear arms. Ah, says the Stratfordian, so that's great, because William Shakespeare of Stratford did bear arms. He was what we call armigerous, and therefore what's wrong with Ben Jonson calling him gentle? Well, there is a problem, actually. Ben Jonson calls him gentle twice, as I have just shown. So he's pushing this point. Now, if he's so concerned and so interested in Stratford Shakespeare's arms, where are they? Now, normally, if this man were Stratford Shakespeare and he'd written this fantastic book and we had this engraving carefully done of him, we would have his arms, possibly up in the top right-hand corner there, for instance. But we don't. If you look at this engraving of Fulke Greville, another poet of the time, perfectly normal, up in the top right corner, there you see his arms. This is the historian, William Camden. This is actually more normal what we've got here. It's an oval frame with his name actually in it, William Camden, written there. And you see his arms there up in the top right-hand corner. Looking at this one, this is actually Edward de Vere's son, the 18th Earl of Oxford. And again, we've got an oval frame, and we've got his name in that oval frame, and we've got his arms just above his head, the famous star, the five-pointed star. This one is Sir Philip Sidney. You see round the edge is written Vera effigies, true effigies, the true likeness of Philip Sidney with his name in the oval once again. And you look at the top left and the top right of the picture, you see the porcupine on a cushion, that's the Sidney crest, and the upside down arrowhead, again a heraldic symbol or badge of the Sidney family. So that's all very, very normal. Going back to this is, I'm afraid, not at all normal. And again, if you look at the uploaded video called Ben Jonson New, I describe some other aspects of this picture which are telling you a lot more than you think you're seeing at first glance. But anyway, there is no coat of arms. Now, most of us watching this are now fully aware that it's a disguise, and Edward de Vere was actually the author. So there are any hints, perhaps, in the first folio about Edward de Vere's arms. I want you to look at this headpiece. It's known as a decorative headpiece, printed at the top of the dedication page. You remember the first folio is dedicated to William, Earl of Pembroke, and to his brother Philip, Earl of Montgomery, who married Edward de Vere's youngest daughter, Susan. Look at the headpiece at the top. It's very, very important, this headpiece, in the first folio, because it appears not just once on the dedication page. It's also there, you notice it at the top of the catalogue. That's essentially the index to the plays. It also appears at the top of the first play, The Tempest. And in the second folio of 1632, it appears 6 times. So this is the most important headpiece of both the folios. And what is it about this headpiece that I want to draw to your attention, and that has some bearing on why Jonson calls him gentle Shakespeare? Have a look at these 2 weird animals on either side here. I should say actually that this headpiece first appears, the first time you ever see it, is in 1582 on a book of poems called Hecatompathia, written by Thomas Watson. Thomas Watson was a servant of the Earl of Oxford. This book is dedicated to the Earl of Oxford, and the Earl of Oxford is its patron, who urges the poet to get it published and clearly assists him in the publication of it. That's the first time this headpiece ever appears. Now here it is in the first folio, 3 times in the first folio. Look at the back legs of those animals. Clearly something very odd about them. What are they, in fact, those animals? Can we work that out? Actually, they're these. You probably can't tell what that is. I'm gonna turn it round. It's a supporter on the arms of the Earl of Oxford. Actually, it's Edward de Vere's grandfather, I think, so possibly his father, actually. Compare this animal to the animals that you've got on the headpiece. You'll see the very thick neck, the rather taut-lined skin, the strange ichthyphallic erection, antlers, curly tail, claws on the feet. If you look particularly at the one on the left of the headpiece there, you can see those claws. This animal does not exist. It's a mythological animal, and we know its name only because of research into the Earls of Oxford, and it's called a Cayley Greyhound. This animal is completely unique to the Earls of Oxford. And you can see why it's got its legs sticking up. They're actually supporters, what we call supporters, which hold up the arms. Now, supporters are not given by grant of arms, and actually you can choose what supporters you have. The Earl of Oxford, Shakespeare, Earl of Oxford, sometimes had something called a harpy, which was signified Ovidian signification of wit, an enigmatic wit. He sometimes used a boar, and he sometimes used these Cayley Greyhounds. The Cayley Greyhounds appear on many, many pieces of plate, silver, seals of the Vere family, and as I say, they are unique to the Vere family. So we have to ask, what the hell are they doing in Shakespeare's first folio? I'd like also to draw your attention to these lovely flowers here. If you know about botany, you'll know instantly what they are by their 5 eagle-talon petals, the sepals and spurs. They're what in Ponzi terms are called aquilegia, but what we normally call columbines. If you look at this, the history of Vere family, John de Vere's will, written, by the way, published long before anyone said that Edward de Vere was Shakespeare. He writes about the Cayley Greyhound, but he goes on from its frequent mention in the inventory. That's the inventory of the Earl of Oxford. The ever beautiful and popular flower called the columbine seems to have been another device used by the Earl of Oxford as a mark of some of his silver, as an ornament of many pieces of plate, and the subject of a magnificent livery collar. So once again, we have not one but 2 heraldic significations of the Earl of Oxford in this decorative headpiece of the first folio. Columbines and Cayley Greyhounds. So we are getting little hints of why he needs to be called Shakespeare is twice called gentle. Okay, I'm now going to go towards the end of the poem, My Gentle Shakespeare, and we're going to find some more signification of the reason why he's called gentle. For a good poet's made as well as born, and such wert thou, he's talking to Shakespeare again. Look how the father's face lives in his issue, even so the race of Shakespeare's mind and manners brightly shines in his well-turned and true-filed lines. Well, there's a surface meaning there, and that's pretty obvious. He's saying that Shakespeare is a very, very good poet, that he's a good poet because he has some natural genius, and as well as the fact that he works for it and has studied and concentrated. And he's saying, look at his lines, and you can tell from his well-mannered and wonderful lines what a good mind he has. But being Ben Jonson, of course, there's always a double meaning, and that double meaning is about hereditary lines. We're talking about Shakespeare's descendants. And you can see that when he says he's born as well, a poet's made as well as born, i.e. birth. Rank is very important, and look how his face lives in his issue, that's i.e. his children, his grandchildren, and his mind and manners brightly shines in his well-turned and true-filed lines. Of course, the double meaning is hereditary lines, not just poetic lines, in his hereditary lines. It's a compliment, of course, to the dedicatee of the first folio. There he is, Lord Montgomery. He and his brother have the first folio of Shakespeare dedicated to him, and there by his side it is his wife, Shakespeare's daughter, Susan de Vere, the youngest daughter of Edward de Vere. She looks a bit distant, actually, and a bit ghostly. The reason for that is she is actually a ghost, literally. Let's have a look at the original painting by Van Dyck, which is at Wilton. Look at her there. She's very gone, wearing black, and her very distant eyes. She's a ghost. She died. She's the mother of all of Lord Montgomery's children, and she died before this painting was made. And Lord Montgomery remarried, and neither he, in fact, nor the children liked his second wife, and certainly didn't wish to commemorate her in this huge 40-foot painting. So they chose instead to put the ghost of their mother in. If you look at this young fellow here, this is the young Philip Herbert, second son, and look how he's looking over at his mother and holding his heart, almost as though he's seen a ghost. His older brother here, Charles, again looking very wistfully towards the ghost of his mother, while his father turns to him and says, look at this beautiful girl beneath you, to whom, by the way, he's betrothed. This is where the future lies. You must marry and have children. He did actually marry her and sadly died of smallpox a few months later, so it was the golden-coloured one there who actually became the next Earl of Pembroke. If you look at this little group of brothers here, one of them is looking up to the little cherubs, and it said that they signify some of his siblings that died in childbirth, while the two on either side, again they're all wearing black and mourning, are again pointing towards their late mother, the ghost of their mother. It's a very touching and beautiful painting, this, when one understands what it's really about. So back to Shakespeare and Ben Jonson. Look how the father's face lives in his issue. These are all Shakespeare's grandchildren, these young boys. Even so, in such a way, the race of Shakespeare's mind and manners brightly shines in his well-turned and true-filed lines, the hereditary lines of William Shakespeare, his grandchildren, and there they are, looking wistfully at Shakespeare's daughter, at their mother, Susan Vere. So again, another reason why Shakespeare is described as gentle. We're talking about rather noble lines. Let's move along. I'm not going to spend much longer. I hope you're not getting bored with this, but there are a couple more interesting points towards the end of this poem. Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James. Sweet Swan. Swan is actually a very traditional way of describing a poet. It goes right back to Horace in ancient classical times, who described Pindar as a swan, and Virgil uses swan to mean a poet, so that's quite normal. Sweet Swan of Avon, that has allowed those who Jonson rather rudely calls those of silliest ignorance, or those of blind affection, I more politely call them Stratfordians, to assume that Avon means Stratford upon Avon. actually, there are about 7 rivers in England called Avon, and one of the reasons for that is Avon just meant water in the sort of Celtic languages. But no, this obviously doesn't mean Avon, though it doesn't mean, sorry, the Warwickshire Avon. But I think that Jonson is being a little bit mischievous. He is allowing those of silliest ignorance, as he calls them, to wander off up to Warwickshire and get the wrong idea. But he's not a liar, Jonson, and he has a message here for the learned. The learned, of course, are those who know English history properly, and they'll know exactly what he means by Avon. Actually, he means this, and I know what you're going to say. No, he doesn't mean that. That's the Thames. Yes, it is the Thames, but I'm talking about the building on the banks of the Thames there, particularly if we look at the Tudor part of it, originally built by Cardinal Wolsey, then confiscated by King Henry VIII, who built an absolutely sumptuous and magnificent house here, which we now call Hampton Court. I want you to look at that roof there. That's the Great Hall. If I take you inside to the inside courtyard, there's the Great Hall there on the left, and let's just have a quick look inside it, because it is extremely magnificent, especially the roof. This is where King James and Queen Elizabeth used to watch plays very, very regularly during seasonal times. They had lots and lots of plays going on here, and they built the great wooden O's, great structures in the middle of this floor, and watched the actors coming in and going out, and it's thought that many Shakespeare plays would have been premiered here at Hampton Court. So you probably think I'm wandering a little away from the question of the sweet Swan of Avon. I'm not really. Here's the most popular and most famous history of Britain at the time. It's called Britannia, and it's by William Camden, who I already mentioned. You can see him there in his oval frame with his coat of arms. Camden, the great historian, who was also Ben Jonson's mentor. Camden, most reverend head, to whom I owe all that I am in arts, all that I know, said Jonson of him. And this book went into at least 5 editions by 1607, so all the learned people in England had a copy in their library. Let's see what it's got to say about Hampton Court. Here we go, page 420. Hampton Court. A stately place of rare and glorious show there is, which Thames with wandering stream doth douse. Times past the name of Avon men it knew. Here Henry the Eighth of that name built an house so sumptuous as that on such an one seek through the world the bright sun never shone. So it's the most sumptuous and wonderful house, and its name was traditionally Avon. So now I think we get a clear understanding of what our clever Mr. Ben Jonson is saying when he says, "Sweet Swan of Avon, what a sight it were to see thee in our waters yet appear, and make those flights upon the banks of Thames that so did take Eliza and our James." Of course, Elizabeth and James never saw any play on the banks of Thames in a public theatre. They never went to the Globe or the Curtain or any of those things. But they did see many plays on the banks of the Thames at Avon, at Hampton Court. So again, saying Sweet Swan of Avon, you're describing Shakespeare as gentle, i.e. noble. He's a courtier poet. Another piece of corroboration and a reason why twice we have to hear gentle poet. Now I'm going to wrap up now. There's just a few lines left and I won't talk of all of them. Let's just look at this bit here. But stay, I see thee in the hemisphere, advanced and made a constellation there. Shine forth, thou star of poets. He's comparing Shakespeare, Edward de Vere, to a star. Why do you think that is? Well, we're back to heraldry again. Here's the Vere coat of arms, and you can see that the only significant charge on it is a 5-pointed white star, Vere le Comte d'Oxford, Angleterre, the Earl of Oxford, the 5-pointed star. This takes us actually back to an old legend of the Vere family, right back. Leyland, the English historian, wrote of a battle outside Antioch during the times of the Crusades, and he writes, "God, willing the safety of the Christians, showed a white star or mollet of 5 points, which to every man's sight did light and arrest upon the standard of Aubrey de Vere, then shining excessively." So it was due to this myth at the Crusades that the de Vere family, having set a white-pointed star settled on his standard, that the white-pointed star became the sign of the Vere family, the most important sign, the badge of the whole family, and there you see it as a charge on his coat of arms. So again, when Ben Jonson says, "Shine forth, thou star of poets," he's always talking in double meanings, and this is yet another pointer to Vere's most significant symbol, which is the star. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I'm sorry if I went on a bit long. I'll try and make them shorter in future. Do subscribe if you're interested, and I'll try and upload these things as often as possible for your pleasure and edification. Thank you for listening.